Hellenic community and all Western Australians who celebrate a Hellenic heritage. Thank you for coming to today's lecture, The Lemnos Heritage of Gallipoli and the Forgotten Foundations of Anzac, presented by one of our community's favourite sons, Dr. John Yanakis. And in welcoming you all, can I also acknowledge from the start with us today, MHR for Perth, the Honourable Alana McTen. Thanks for being with us, Alana. Professor Reg Appleyard and Mrs. Wendy Appleyard, Mr. Evan Kakoulis, Chairman of the Australian Hellenic Council, and James Dexter from the WA Museum. As I said, thank you for being with us. Thank you to all of you. We've also received apologies today from RSL President Graham Edwards, Consul for Greece, the Honourable Sophia Pauli, Senator Dean Smith, MLAs Eleni Evangel and Michelle Roberts, MLC Peter Katsambanis and Professor Jenny Gregory. Now the Greek-Australian community in WA has been very indulged and very privileged in having its very own resident historian, Dr. John Yanakis, within our community structure for years. And John's long served in various formal positions, including the Vice President of the Community, Trustee, and currently as our Chief Trustee. And as many of you know, he's published extensively on the local history of Greeks in WA. Over the past 3 or 4 years now, John's been researching the much neglected Lemnos ANZAC connection, which included him visiting Lemnos several times to seek out primary sources, and whilst he was there last year, he also delivered a paper on the topic at an international conference, and subsequent to that he was also asked to deliver his findings to audiences in both Melbourne and Sydney. And in acknowledging the centenary of the Gallipoli landing and the Anzac commemoration next year, the Hellenic community is delighted to sponsor today's event. And we hope to have another, a little further down the track, the dedication of our honour board to our service personnel as part of the commemorative celebrations. And Alana has just whispered to me as well that there might be, together with a youth group, a play that's to be presented which highlights the Lemnos involvement in the Gallipoli story. And we'll bring you much more of that as it comes to hand. Now there's a lengthier version of today's presentation that's already been included as a referred chapter in a book just published titled Lest We Forget Australia at War and Peace. And the research has sparked considerable interest, with key personnel at the museum's ANZAC Interpretative Centre being built in Albany, having had preliminary discussions with John to ensure the role of Lemnos is not forgotten in the story being told. John tells me, however, there's much more to be done to preserve the story of the role of Lemnos in the Anzac history, and there exists a need for a more substantial publication to be completed, and that of course requires investment and hard to find funding, which John tells me will be sought. Ladies and gentlemen, the Lemnos Heritage of Gallipoli and the Forgotten Foundations of Anzac, Dr. John Yanakis.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you everybody for coming along. I do appreciate you coming out on a Sunday afternoon, and the weather being somewhat inclement, not as bad as yesterday, but yeah, thank you nevertheless. I'd also like to thank, while I'm giving thank yous, the Hellenic community for giving me the opportunity to present not exactly what I presented last year, but something similar to what I presented last year on Lemnos, and in particular, obviously, Gary and Cheryl and John Metaxas. Cheryl really ended up driving this, and she's been a bit ill the last week, but a lot of the impetus, if you like, for this to happen came from Cheryl. John and also Bill Courtney for setting up today. So, obviously, I'll begin. And what you see in front of you is a slide from Lemnos, from the harbour town of Mudros, one of 2 Anzac streets that can be found in this rather remote Greek island. So, despite the fact that the Greek island of Lemnos was just some 100 kilometres from the Gallipoli Peninsula, and having played a crucial role in the 8-month Dardanelles campaign, the island is virtually unknown to most Australians. While there is much written about Gallipoli, Lemnos is not usually included in the discourse. Though the popularity of pilgrimages to Anzac Cove continues to grow, Lemnos remains a neglected corner of the physical site and of the historical accounts of Gallipoli. It has been marginalised over time and is not conceptualised as part of the Gallipoli campaign. Yet, it was vital to the military encounter. So, let me just try and get this to work right. Okay. So this is just one of a couple of maps trying to give you an idea as to where Lemnos sits in the East Aegean. Much of what has been recorded and written about Lemnos deals with the establishment and the operation of the hospitals on the island for the wounded from Gallipoli. The medical facilities on the island are a relatively well-known element of the Gallipoli narrative. Less known are the recuperative, recreational and other similar activities that took place on the island. Also overlooked by much of the existing scholarship is the fact that the archives of the existing scholarship is the fact that the activities on Lemnos both preceded and succeeded the landings and evacuation of the peninsula. Mudros Harbour was the point at which the various Allied forces began to assemble some months prior to the 25th of April landings. And Lemnos was also the place where many of those evacuated from Gallipoli were taken. Furthermore, according to various writers, including the head of the Centre for Historical Research at the National Museum of Australia, Peter Stanley, another Gallipoli legend began on Lemnos. John Kirkpatrick Simpson's donkey, Murphy, was acquired on the island. Lemnos can therefore claim to have a significant place in the foundational events of the Anzac mythology. It was also the location where the war with the Ottoman Empire ended in October 1918 aboard, appropriately, the HMS Agamemnon in Mudros Harbour. Yet its importance is not known or understood by much of the Australian population. While the military and civilian links between Australia and Greece, particularly Crete, during World War II were recognised and publicly highlighted, for example, the 70th anniversary commemorative celebrations of the Battle of Crete in May 2011, and more recently, BBC interest in the connections between Prevely in the state's southwest and Crete. The ties between the two countries during World War I are not. And just another sort of simple little map here. Just again to sort of highlight where Lemnos sits. You can see it is particularly close to the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, I visited Lemnos the first time in 2011, and one of the things that struck me was the size of the harbour, or the bay, that the island has situated within it. And it's sort of like a large U-shape, and it became pretty obvious. You didn't have to be some sort of military strategist to realise that the size and the depth of the harbour is what attracted the British to use this as a base to launch the campaign against the Ottomans. Many questions therefore arise about the Allied presence on Lemnos, including what official knowledge existed about the island and its people before the occupation took place. How was the Allied presence on Lemnos viewed, officially and unofficially, by the Greek government of the day? Also requiring further investigation is what sorts of relationships developed between the locals and the foreigners, notably the Anzacs. Did their presence disrupt or interfere with Lemnian society? What has been passed on to the local inhabitants of Lemnos about the Allied and particularly Australian presence? Was there any opposition to the Allied presence on the island? There is also no consideration given to the social, political and economic effects the arrival of 20th century technologies had on the people and the structures of this remote Greek island that still function as a rural subsistence community. This paper aims to help with the process of reanimating the vital heritage of Lemnos by exploring areas of neglect and suggesting new research so as to help redress the island's marginalisation in the history of Gallipoli and World War I. So Australia's first military engagement in World War I in Gallipoli has provided the nation, as we all know, with a day of remembrance and reflection. The Australian War Memorial notes that this day of remembrance, Anzac Day, is probably Australia's most important national occasion. Hence, for 99 years, the Gallipoli campaign and the First World War in general have attracted considerable historical and sociological interest for Australia. However, the neglect, oversight or minimisation of the part played by Lemnos and its people is found in many works. For example, Bill Gamage's The Broken Years, published in 1974 and reprinted several times, describes the experience of Australian soldiers of the time based on their letters and their diaries. This social history of the war, and not just the Gallipoli campaign, does not, however, provide insight into Greek-Australian relations and Lemnos. While the book, this is a quote, remains one of the finest books about Australians at war, and it certainly was a landmark publication because it broke away from the idea of military history just being about operational and strategic events. It highlights a gap in the historical record that needs to be addressed. Bill Gamage was later employed as the military advisor on Peter Weir's 1981 film Gallipoli, and he also worked on the screenplay of the film, a film from which many Australians gained their strongest impressions about the Gallipoli campaign. And no question, it's a great film, and Mel Gibson's terrific in it and all that sort of thing, but there is no reference to Lemnos in this popular visual account. And what you see in the Gallipoli film is, of course, they go from Western Australia to Egypt. From Egypt, they're at Gallipoli. Well, all of them went via Lemnos. Now, recently, this same sort of retelling, if you like, looked like it was going to be reproduced in the interpretive centre that the museum is involved in, the ANZAC Interpretive Centre that the museum is involved in down at Albany, in the narrative and the story that they were going to display. However, that's not going to be the case. We've had some discussions, and Lemnos will get some sort of referencing. The work of Australia's official historian of the First World War, Charles Bean, cannot be ignored when considering what has been said about the Gallipoli campaign. In his first two volumes of the official history of Australia in the war of 1914-1918, he provides the most comprehensive chronicling of the campaign. But when it comes to Lemnos, even Bean limits his discussion to military matters and the physical landscape. His chapter, The Dardanelles Expedition, makes considerable reference to Lemnos. Bean discusses the British fleet's need for a suitable harbour and the various alternative islands being considered, but he concludes Lemnos possessed the finest haven of all in Mudros Bay. The subsequent preparations for the landing of the Allied forces and the sending of an Australian brigade to the island are also discussed. Numerous articles, papers and texts examine particular facets of the campaign. Many medical and military accounts and archives can be found referring to conditions, preparations, manoeuvres and casualties. Some reference to the islanders is made, but not in any great depth or with any particular understanding of the local inhabitants. The transportation of the wounded, the unhygienic conditions of the hospitals, water shortages, sickness and disease, lack of dental care, the different provisions supplied to the various Allied hospitals, and relations between the different national medical services tend to be discussed. Sorry. Various photos, personal accounts such as soldier and nurses' diaries, official reports, correspondence and dispatches by various governments assist in uncovering aspects of the nature and effects of Allied and Greek interaction. The comments in the many nurses' diaries also provide insight into the war experience. As Katrina Hedich notes, their stories are a priceless and detailed first-hand record of the Gallipoli campaign's medical history. In the meantime, Australian newspapers remain an untapped source of information about conditions and experiences on Lemnos during 1915. Some writers have utilised soldiers' diaries to tell the Gallipoli story, but their accounts remain fundamentally a story about the day-to-day experiences of Australian soldiers, particularly the deprivations endured on the peninsula. Literature about the 1915 campaign continues to be published, while some authors, including Graham Seal and Jim Clavin, make mention of Australian personnel interacting with Lemnians. Most work does not give much consideration, if any, to the inhabitants of the island from where the campaign was launched. Les Carley's one publication, Gallipoli, for instance, includes only 2 references to Lemnos or Mudros in its 569 pages. Gary Hutchinson's An Australian Odyssey, From Giza to Gallipoli, makes no reference to Lemnos, nor does his Gallipoli, the Pilgrimage Guide. Bruce Skates, Return to Gallipoli, also neglects to mention Lemnos or Mudros. More recently, Peter Stanley's Simpson's Donkey opens on Lemnos. The Gallipoli campaign has, over time, narrowed to exclude any location other than the peninsula, even though sites such as Lemnos were integral to the expedition. So, just a couple of images here of the island back in 1915, taken by some Australian soldiers. So, if we just consider the sort of the story of the narrative as it currently sort of exists, before landing at Gallipoli, and then again during the 8-month campaign, Lemnos played an important role in the unfolding catastrophe. Lemnos was the base from where the Entente, or Allied forces, launched the Gallipoli campaign. Liberated from Ottoman rule during the First Balkan War of 1912, the island became the base for the fight against the Ottoman Empire. In February 1915, the Greek Prime Minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, granted the British access to the island with its large natural harbour at Mudros. Soon after, Anglo-French forces massed a large armada and infantry forces. It was here that the Australians practiced beach landings in preparation for the assault on Gallipoli. Accordingly, the Australians departed by ship from Egypt for the Gallipoli Peninsula after several months of training near Cairo. They then landed at what became known as Anzac Cove on the 25th of April 1915 and established a tenuous foothold on the steep slopes beneath the beach. During the early days of the campaign, the Allies attempted to break through Turkish lines, while the Turks tried to drive the Allied troops off the peninsula. Efforts on both sides ended in failure, and the ensuing stalemate continued for the remainder of 1915. The most successful operation of the campaign was the evacuation of the troops on the 19th and 20th of December. This brief and typical retelling of the campaign neglects the important role played by Lemnos and its people. Balkans war expert Dr. Helen Katsiadakis notes how Lemnos and neighbouring islands reverted to Greece in 1912 after centuries of Ottoman rule. But the specific detail of the arrangement that followed, which resulted in these islands being controlled by the British, are not well understood. While local attitudes to the new occupiers appear to have been positive, the degree of suspicion or animosity towards the British or any collaboration with the Turks has not been investigated. And obviously these are some images of Australians in preparation for the Gallipoli campaign. Greece would eventually enter the war in July 1917, with the king under such intense Allied pressure that he departed the country. Prime Minister Venizelos returned to Athens, assuming control of the government. The Greek army, however, would not be ready for any serious action until early 1918. Thus, the role of Lemnos in the earlier events on Gallipoli has not been thoroughly examined from a Greek perspective either. Indeed, there is even less Greek historiography about the island during the World War I period than English language histories. Hence, the proposed research hopes to uncover the other side of the Lemnos story, as well as unearth more information about Anzac circumstances and activities on the island. Various Greek scholars, including Katsidakis, and Greek government officials are keen to see what new insights into the Australia-Hellenic Republic's relations such research would uncover. In 1915, and I think you can see it from some of the two previous images, Lemnos was underdeveloped, with few roads, major buildings and limited infrastructure. Its villagers led what can only be described as a simple life, scratching a living from the land and trading their surpluses of food and produce with outsiders. However, during their 8 months on Lemnos, the soldiers, nurses and engineers of the Allies would transform the island. Roads and piers would be built, bridges repaired, water sources improved, and the villagers would find a new source of income in supplying the thousands of new visitors to the island. The locals would benefit from access to, from access to new medical services built on the island for the wounded from Gallipoli. As they toured across the island, enjoying some free time, the soldiers and nurses interacted socially with their Lemnian neighbours. This meeting of peoples and cultures is communicated in some of their writings and photographs. By the time Captain, later Lieutenant Colonel, Frederick Forrest of the 3rd Field Artillery Brigade landed on Lemnos on the 10th of April 1915, there were already some 3,200 Australians on the island. Captain Forrest described the island as pretty. Greek farms studded the foreshore and hills. Mudros was an ideal harbour, he said, well protected and full of ships, transports, warships and hospital ships, warships of all nations. His diary entry for the 16th of April notes that the Greek inhabitants were all very friendly disposed to us. Soon after, Lance Corporal Archibald Barwick made his own observations about Lemnos. Lemnos is a one-horse place. The people are practically all Greek, and they are 100 years behind the times. They do all their own spinning from the raw wool and make their own clothes from it. There are some very pretty girls. They are snow white and very shy. The Greek children would stand with their mouths wide open and gaze at the gramophone while it was playing as if it was some sort of marvellous thing. Meanwhile, the Australian infantry began its strenuous training on the shores of the harbour, carrying heavy backpacks while scurrying up the nearby hills. The men were to be practiced at communicating information in battle and at carrying a full load. There were constant landing and rushes up the foothills. Captain Forrest recorded that even horses were sent ashore for exercise. He undertook landing practice on the 19th of April, and by then many more troopers had entered the bay. These soldiers included British, French and Indian personnel. For a few days after the Anzac landing, obviously the 25th of April 1915, a number of Greeks and their donkeys served on the beaches as water carriers. They were soon evacuated, as was the Greek who operated a canteen on the landing beach. Nevertheless, Greeks continued to ferry in supplies by small craft, and in several places they were employed building jetties. In May, at Cape Hellas, Greek porters were unloading stores from pontoons on the beach while under fire. Michael Tycoon comments on Greek traders benefiting from the sale of foodstuffs to diggers, but beyond these monetary transactions and hardships created from the scarcity of water, how these two different peoples interacted, he does not say. As a medical facility, Lemnos was intended at first to deal with severe cases only. Less severe cases only. Okay? That is, those likely to be well within 28 days. There were soon, however, over 30 Allied hospital ships at the island to help tackle the large number of cases. And part of the reason for that is that the British had not expected to be held up at Gallipoli, so they didn't really build, initially anyway, sufficient facilities to cater for the casualties that soon started to appear. As the campaign intensified, Lemnos began to play an even more significant role in the treatment of the ill and the seriously wounded. Convalescence emerged as a major problem, compounded by the lack of preparatory engineering development at Lemnos. With the increase in casualties from offensives in August and the abundance of sick that followed in late August, September and October, it became necessary to develop Lemnos as an intermediate military base. Approximately 130 Australian nurses served at the hospitals on the island, and many more on the hospital ships. One of those who arrived as part of the 3rd Australian General Hospital staff was Sister Rachel Pratt. She was immediately taken back by the conditions she found at Lemnos. Not only was the island barren, but the basics were still to be established. There were no marquees for the wounded or accommodation for the staff, and no hospital equipment. Things were therefore in a rather state of chaos when the wounded began to arrive, she wrote. Equipment turned up 3 weeks later, and the situation seemed less hopeless, though the number of wounded and sick remained pressing. Dysentery was the scourge of the island, she said. These cases placed an extra burden on the hospitals and the nurses. There was little shade from the fierce summer heat for the nurses, and there were not enough mosquito nets. The flies were particularly bad for all on Lemnos, with the problem compounded by poor sanitation arrangements. The shortage of water on the island, to which many soldiers and nurses referred in diaries and letters, did not help the situation. Sister Nellie Pike described the situation thus. Our water came from the warships until a condenser was built on the island to convert salt water into fresh. No bread was available, only tough army biscuits. Later, our rations improved, but by the grace of the Red Cross, not through army issue. Soldiers recovering from an injury or on respite from the battlefield found many aspects of Lemnos to their liking. In the little villages, good meals can be obtained, especially those delicious continental omelettes, the quaint old windmills on the hill, and the church in the village square, where the gossips gathered together, were reminiscent of the old world life, made familiar to us in our youth by means of books and pictures. Oranges, tangerines and figs are plentiful and cheap, penned one soldier. However, what many of them enjoyed most of all were the thermal springs on the island. But the excursion most in favour with the Australians was to the hot springs on the slope of Mount Thurman. Round these had been built a rest house. To the man who had not had a decent wash for nearly 4 months, the opportunity was revelled in. Another soldier wrote, "So out to Thermos hurried the men, to whom a hot bath was a boon beyond price. The procedure was to strip off and with a little dipper pour water over oneself. Thermos became the most popular resort on the island. A couple of soldiers are trying to make their way to the springs, which now, by the way, there is a nice fancy facility there and a restaurant and a souvenir shop in front of. The importance of Lemnos as a medical centre became even more apparent during the latter half of the Gallipoli campaign. Between the 7th of August and the 11th of November, 96,943 sick and wounded arrived at Mudros from the beaches. With accommodation stretched, large numbers of cases had to be evacuated to England and Egypt. An Adelaide newspaper, The Register, recorded how it was impossible to convey what was happening at that Lemnos hospital, with its 2 overworked orderlies and its equally overworked doctor, the flies, the sand, the wild grass and weeds, and rough food. Patients with all sorts of diseases had been nursed: smallpox, fevers, pleurisy, pneumonia, dysentery, and bullet and shrapnel wounds galore. Lemnos was arguably the essential obverse of Gallipoli. While Gallipoli was the site of conflict, its landscape almost immediately sacralised, the essential role of Lemnos was effectively a secular counterworld of care, respite, entertainment, renewal and normality. As well as being physically removed from the fighting, troops were able to interact with civilians, females, nurses and Lemnians. They could sleep, eat, be clean and generally participate in practices associated with peace rather than war. In relation to his experience of Lemnos with elements of the 4th Infantry Brigade, General John Monash commented on the sudden transference from an environment of strife and clamour and wreckage of war to this peaceful island with its rolling landscapes. A similar sentiment was expressed by the West Australian Governor, Sir William Campion, in July 1926, when he opened a veterans' hospice for the mentally incapacitated in Shenton Park called Lemnos Home. He said that no more suitable name than Lemnos could have been selected for the home. The soldiers who fought at Gallipoli would remember Lemnos as a peaceful island and an ideal place for resting. Like the island, the hospital was to be a haven. Every year, tens of thousands of Australians make their way to Gallipoli, the Western Front in France, and other sites of the Great War. Some go in search of family memory, seeking the grave of a soldier lost a lifetime ago. For others, an Anzac pilgrimage has become a rite of passage, a statement of what it means to be Australian. This is particularly the case for the many who visit the Gallipoli Peninsula. While attending the Anzac Day dawn service is the pinnacle pilgrimage experience for many, there are now numerous tours on offer, virtually all year round for the visitor to Gallipoli. However, the island of Lemnos does not feature in any of these pilgrimages. The place that is visualised as Gallipoli does not include neighbouring Lemnos, even though, as discussed, the campaign began and for many soldiers ended there. Thus Lemnos is an underrepresented component, not just of the Gallipoli campaign, but of Gallipoli tourism. Since 2001, commemorative services have been held on Lemnos in memory of all of those who died in the Gallipoli campaign. A service takes place at the larger of the 2 war cemeteries on the island, near the port town of Mudros, and at the port itself, where a war memorial has been erected. In 2002, the memorial at Mudros Harbour was unveiled as a permanent reminder of the role played by Lemnos in the Gallipoli campaign. The Hellenic sub-branch of the Victorian RSL and the Greek Medical and Legal Association, which commissioned the project, arranged with local Greek authorities for the funding and construction of the 1.5 square metre memorial and for an annual ceremony to be held on Anzac Day or thereabouts at Mudros. The commemorative memorial, with its plaque labelled in Greek and English, Australia and Lemnos, 1915-1916, is on local council land near the harbour's edge. An image of a nurse and the official Australian insignia can also be found on the Australian manufactured plaque. And obviously that's the memorial and the plaque, which outlines basically Lemnos' role and has some casual figures there as well. The Lemnos Municipal Council and the Lemnian Association of Victoria hoped that the memorial would become part of the pilgrimage for Australians who want to pay homage to the deeds of those who risked their lives at Gallipoli. This hasn't happened to date, but locals remain hopeful. The Mayor of Mudros expressed the view that he found it strange that so many people visited Gallipoli, the site of so much suffering and death, and did not visit the place, the counterworld, where the Anzacs were hosted. The potential to develop Lemnos and Mudros in particular as another destination for those visiting sites related to the Gallipoli campaign is evident. Additionally, the inclusion of Lemnos on the Anzac pilgrimage trail could help reduce the burden of numbers and associated problems impacting on Gallipoli. There is a growing concern, as expressed by Harvey Broadbent, that some of the sites on the peninsula are being denigrated. If the geographic and conceptual space of what and where Gallipoli is can be expanded in the minds of Australians and Turks, not only will the local Lemnian economy benefit, but the pressure on the Gallipoli sites may be reduced. The modern visitor to Lemnos can find plenty of evidence of the Allied presence of 1915. For example, graves at the two war cemeteries. Of the 1,235 Allied soldiers buried at either the Mudros or Portianos cemeteries, there can be found 148 Australians and 76 New Zealanders. The main military cemetery on Lemnos is at East Mudros, about 1 kilometre from the town and next to the civilian graveyard. The cemetery was begun in April 1915 and contains 885 Commonwealth graves, including 98 Australians, plus 32 burials of other nationalities, mainly Russians. The other military cemetery, as I mentioned just a second ago, is near the village of Portianos. This cemetery commenced in August 1915 as a result of some of the activities like Lone Pine and the Neck on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and was used until August 1920. At this location, there are 50 Australians buried. So there's just a couple of images of the cemeteries, which are, and you can see probably in the one on the right, they are very well looked after. Australian War Graves Commission and so on, as people look after them. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which Australia contributes. Less well-known examples of the Allied presence on Lemnos are the British rum jars, and they're everywhere, now used by locals as water containers and vases. And there are also some archaeological finds, and they themselves are interesting because some of those archaeological finds are remnants from the First World War, but of course there are also archaeological diggings going on Lemnos that go back to pre-Christian times. Additionally, there are large eucalyptus trees on the island, and at least 2 streets named Anzac. Remnants of the wooden pier facilities used by the different Allied forces, including Australians, are also visible in the bay at Mudros. This is obviously coming back to the cemetery, or cemeteries. These little plaques sort of run across. So there's not necessarily large tombstones here. The bulk of the soldiers that are buried there, the markers are like this. They're just little squares. And some of them have some very interesting little comments, epitaphs and things on them. You see the case of this fellow here. He was aged 19. He answered his country's call, loved, remembered by all. Some are actually a bit sadder than that. So, just in finishing up, this paper seeks to raise awareness of the need for further investigation into the importance of Lemnos to the Gallipoli campaign and of the island's contribution to the Anzac legend. Existing literature has tended to understate the significance of Lemnos to the entire Dardanelles venture. While acknowledging that Lemnos is mentioned in various campaign accounts, the intended research aims for a deeper and less disparate investigation so as to better explain the nature of spatial and cultural relationships between the islanders and the Anzacs. A better understanding of the complexities of the interactions at various levels is being advocated. Research such as that I'm proposing would help overcome the marginalisation of Lemnos in the history and mythology of Gallipoli. Thank you very much. So I'm prepared to take questions, whatever. I'm not necessarily going to be able to answer them all, but yeah.
Yes, John, why was Lemnos scripted out? What was the reason?
That's a good question. That's part of what I'd like to be able to sort of uncover. From what I can see, that in the 1920s, if you were reading about Gallipoli, Lemnos was part of the story. But slowly over time, whether because we started to say more about Gallipoli and what was happening, and more was being incorporated into that story, Lemnos started to fall by the wayside. So it hasn't always been that way, it seems. But that is, yes, that's one of the things I'd certainly like to find out a little bit more about. But when you look at some of the things that have been written, even some of the textbook accounts kids were using at school from the 20s, Lemnos gets much more of a mention than it has done in more recent, well, I guess since the Second World War. Yeah.
I'd like to add to that because I'm 62, and when I was 10 years old, our teachers every Anzac Day, prior Anzac, would give a big talk to the children at school, our state schools. And not only has Lemnos been marginalised, but the whole story of Gallipoli itself has been marginalised and more marginalised till many young Australians don't know the whole story even of Gallipoli. It's only what's taught to them and what comes up to them, and they know what they saw in the movie Gallipoli. And one thing I want to ask you, you said that in the harbour there were many warships of many nationalities. What countries were all the warships from?
The bulk of them were British and French. In fact, the vast majority were British and French. But there appears to have been some Canadian ships, and there were a couple of Australian transport ships.
Okay, and what about the Japanese ships?
I don't know if the Japanese went to Europe. The Japanese were certainly...
My teachers told me that when the Australian troop ships went to Gallipoli, the Japanese Navy, which at that time was the best in the world, better than the British, because their ships were built in Britain and France, and they had the latest technology, and the Japanese were our very staunch allies prior to World War I, and during World War I, their Navy sailed to Australia and it escorted the Australian troop ships. The Japs rode shotgun for the Australian troop ships.
That wouldn't surprise me, up at least until Egypt anyway, because of course there was an Anglo-British alliance signed in 1902. So for some of us who may not be aware that in World War I, Japan was actually on the same side. Unlike World War II, they were actually an ally of Great Britain. So what you're saying would not surprise me at all. And clearly they were very significant in the Pacific, the Japanese Navy in fighting the Germans in the Pacific.
And also when the ships arrived in the Mediterranean, they had no orders to leave. And they were the ones that after the World War I finished, they were still there, and they were the ones that fired a volley over the French warships that were tied in the seaport of Smyrna, telling the French in no uncertain terms that if they didn't stop their atrocities of chopping off the hands of the people trying to get onto these ships, because the French ships were docked in the harbour and the Greek army and all was bottled up in there, that they would be at war. The next one would be fired into them and they'd be at war. And that's part of history and that's documented for anyone who wants to Google it today.
Carolyn?
What sense did you get when you went to Lemnos of the understanding of the local people in terms of what their role was and how important it was? And do you feel that they are really enthusiastic about becoming part of the tourism, the Gallipoli tourism?
Okay, yeah. The locals would be very keen to see more tourists there, no question. The biggest obstacle to that is actually Turkey. There's no direct, even though they're only 100 kilometres away, 60 miles, whatever it is, there is no direct sea transport, no sea route from Lemnos to the Gallipoli Peninsula. To get to Gallipoli, you basically have to come down from Istanbul. It would make sense if you could get to Lemnos or get to the Gallipoli Peninsula, get on a boat and go across. The locals are certainly well aware of the ANZAC contribution. Apart from the memorial services and so on they have, in their schools, in the high school level, they designate, sort of in addition to the national curriculum they use, they actually designate a lesson around ANZAC Day about that whole experience and the significance of the island to the First World War. The other interesting thing I found when I was there, in speaking to some of the old timers, that there is a sort of memory, and a number of them expressed the view, and some people in Sydney had actually said the same thing, that when their children, okay, were of an age when they wanted to migrate, okay, particularly between the wars and then again after the Second World War, and they could have gone to Greece proper or Canada or the United States or Australia. Some of the old timers, or of course who have passed away, would say to them, if you have to leave the island and you're going somewhere to migrate, go to Australia. They are good people. Their memories of, you know, their grandparents, their great-grandparents' memories of the ANZAC soldiers was actually very positive. So, again, that's the sort of thing I'd like to chase up further. There's a lot of stuff in the Greek Foreign Office and the Hellenic Archives in Athens, but much of that correspondence, this is between British and the Greek government and the Australian government and so on. A lot of that material is in French. I need a translator. So, yeah.
John, this folks up here in the early 1915, and before the ANZAC code was sorted by the Allies. Now there are two problematic things that happened before then, as I recall, which I think in the Dardanelles, which was a failure. And then the second error, as I understand it, was the choice of the location of ANZAC code as the point of assault. Now, you know, I think most people would know that other places 2 or 3 kilometres away could have been chosen. Is there any from your reading, was Lemnos anything more than a port on the way to Anzac? I mean, was there any role, for example, in that first naval invasion, was Lemnos used as a port then for that one? And secondly, is there any evidence that there was an error arose from Lemnos in that choice of Anzac code?
Well, yeah, when that naval assault happened, Lemnos was the base from which that armada went across. The landing mistake, look, they just got it wrong. Whether they didn't know the waters well enough, they hadn't done enough reconnaissance, and the troop carriers just drifted. Yeah, because you're right, they ended up somewhere where they shouldn't have been.
Did the British choose that site, or was there any?
Well, where the British had wanted them to land was, it was somewhere else, like you said, 2-3 miles further south, yeah, from where they ended up. Yeah, but see, when you go to the island, one of the things that's really interesting is you have to hunt around to find the remnants of the British presence from World War I. I mean, there's things like the street signs, there's the rum jars, and remnants of the pier. But permanent buildings are very hard to find. But there's lots of permanent buildings that the Germans built in World War II. In fact, there's an army barracks at Mudros, and that army barracks was the German army barracks, and the Greeks are using it now. There's a playing field, like a soccer ground, that the Germans had actually established. Because when the Germans went there in, whatever it was, 41, 42, the Germans went to stay. The British only thought they were going to be in Lemnos for a very short time, that they were going to push back at Gallipoli and storm up the peninsula and get to Constantinople. So all the engineering works, that's why when those nurses were talking about there was nothing here, because a lot of that engineering work hadn't been done because the British didn't expect to be there for very long. And of course, they found that the Turks were a more formidable opponent than they had anticipated. Yeah.
One thing my teachers told me at that time was that when the Anzac troops went to land, they did drift a long way off their targeted, landings.
Yeah.
And that's why they got it more wrong than what they did.
Yeah.
I don't know if this would help direct your further research. I'm a teacher and Katie's a teacher, so we teach Australian history, we're high school teachers. So kids today cover the Anzac legend in the Year 9 curriculum, and they do it. We don't teach them myth, we teach them what actually happened.
Yep.
From a teacher's perspective and from my own personal perspective, because I've taken my family and my children, I've been to Gallipoli, I think the focus of your research should be on the relationship between the local people on the island and the Anzacs, and that's the legacy that needs you to further research to bring back what happened. In terms of you looking at it to take away, you mentioned in your talk before, take away the pressure, of going and visiting Gallipoli. I don't think that will ever happen because the island is not the burial ground, like you've obviously been to Gallipoli. So for me, and I've travelled, I haven't travelled massively everywhere around the world, but Gallipoli is probably the most moving place for me that I've ever been to.
Yeah.
So I think, Lemnos is not a grave site, but the fact that the wounded were there and it was a place of healing, maybe that's where the focus needs to be. And the relationship between the Anzacs and the locals.
Yeah, no, look, thank you for that. Yes, and it is an area that I do want to look at. Beyond what's just in sort of the diaries of the soldiers and the nurses, but that personal link, I think, is really, really important. And I think what the locals see in terms of the tourism thing is that, obviously, Lemnos isn't going to replace Gallipoli because of, this is where these people fought and died and so on, but that you could do day trips there. One of the things that's happening now on the Gallipoli Peninsula is that, and it's called, the Turkish government is actually now, you're starting to see it, they're actually imposing limits on how many people can visit. Because you're starting to get people just backpacking, setting up tents, camping all over the place. So what the locals on Lemnos are saying is, well, camp here, stay here, spend a day here, get on a boat, go across, do, like a cruise, spend the day there, then come back. And of course, spend your money here on, on Lemnos. So, no, they're valid points. Thank you. Jim.
Looking at migration to Australia, I think in your talk you mentioned that there was a landing in the society in Victoria, isn't it? So was that post-Second World War?
Yeah, most of it is post-Second World War, but there were remnants here between the two world wars. There's large numbers of them in Melbourne and in Sydney, and according to Gilchrist, Hugh Gilchrist, two very early Greek settlers to Australia, I can't remember now if it's the 1860s, 1870s or whatever, were Lemnians.
They weren't as prolific as...
Not in Western Australia, but if you go to Sydney and Melbourne, there's heaps of them. So, just the check.
Just a quick one. So what was, do you know the population of the island at the time?
Yeah, it was somewhere between 12 to 15,000. Yeah, and there's about 15,000 there now. Yeah. John?
That was going to be my question.
Oh,
What's the island like now?
yeah. Arthur?
What's the area, the size of the island?
That I couldn't tell you. It is, not off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, but it is, it's reasonably large. It is a reasonably large island. It's probably not quite as big as Rhodes. Similar size to Rhodes, but in a different shape, different configuration. Not quite as big. Pete?
John, what was the impact on the population? Like the development of the island, the emotional and economic development after that sort of injection of modernity, based on the fact that when someone in the talk noticed that they used to spin their own wool.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I really am interested in, along with the personal relationships, because the impact, that sort of technological impact, seems to have been limited. When the British left, they left behind a water condenser, desalination plant, whatever you want to call it, docks and things like that, which continued to be used. But new technology, like from the Greek perspective of them developing electricity or whatever, that seems to have slowed. It didn't seem to take hold. But I don't know that conclusively. So that's one of the sorts of things I want to, try to find out. Arthur, thank you.
John, what sort of program do you have in mind to do your future research?
Okay, so what's happened there, Arthur, is that I've been to the island twice. I need to spend more time in Athens. I need to find someone who can understand highfalutin French. But all of that requires some funding. So we applied a couple of years ago, myself and a couple of other academics, an ANZAC scholar. In fact, I mentioned a guy, Graham Seal, must have been the year before last now, for a federal government, an ARC grant, Australian Research Council grant. Very painstaking, but unfortunately we were unsuccessful. We made the final 20% or whatever it is to get through, but we didn't get over the edge. So we're hoping, so we've given it a break, we've reconfigured our application a bit and hope to apply again in November of this year to try to get funding for the middle of next year for 2 to 3 years. So I'm looking at a 2 to 3 year project.
To be over there to do?
No. To sort of do the research, to draft something, to come up with, a fuller publication. it would be very difficult to do this without that sort of funding.
What's on the budget, John? Give us a figure.
Well, no, I haven't come. This isn't to try to raise funds for. I've come here. No,
Really?
Look, you're looking at anywhere. So let's say $250,000 over 3 years. Yeah.
John, could you approach the those companies that do tours and stuff like that and tell them, make some sort of a map where people can leave Australia, Perth, Sydney, Melbourne, go to Lemnos the way the old ANZACs did and do the tour? And from your research, the harbour's big enough to hold a big cruise ship.
Sounds good, sounds good. But funding has become, particularly in the humanities over the last 10 years, funding has become harder and harder to get. But it might be something to think about. Final question, maybe? Yes, sorry, the lady there.
Brendan Nelson from the Australian War Memorial be able to assist you in any of these ventures?
Look, we actually wrote, before Brendan Nelson was the director, we wrote to them and yeah, they're pretty tight for funds too. The money that they've recently received has been to fix up displays and it's all very understandable, improve the exhibits and so on. But he's a sort of individual who might be a little bit more open. There's a lot of money being provided at the moment for the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing, right? Each federal electorate, the local representative has been given somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000, right? But that money is for commemorative services, for public exhibitions, for displays, for parades, that sort of thing, rather than for research. Okay, folks, thank you very much.
Thank you to John, thank you on behalf of the community. I'm sure we'll be back here in 2 or 3 years' time when the research, which has just begun, has more meat to the bones at that point in time. Can I also thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking the time out to come and listen to John, and a very special thank you to my maid Neil Hancock, who has a bit of a birthday today in that his 2-month-old daughter celebrates her 2 months today, and he's taken time out to put this on the historical record. So thank you to you. Alana McTiernan had to leave and apologise to you all that she had to leave. She actually stayed a little bit longer than she told us she was going to, but she also said that she would like you all to know that coming up, as I said in the beginning, is a theatrical production which will include much of this research in the play that's being written right now, and she'd like a transcript of all of it so she can pass it on to the author, and we'll make that transcript available. If it's all right with you, mate?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see you in a couple of years when John's delivering again. Thank you very much. There are no good on today, and cookies, tea and coffee. Thanks very much.